Welcome to the podcast about investing in startups, where existing investors can learn how to get the best deal possible. And those that have never before invested in startups can learn the keys to success from the venture experts. Your host is Nick Moran, and this is The Full Ratchet.
Welcome to another special release of Investor Stories. On this installment, the experts discuss a startup that they did not invest in, why they passed, and if there was a key learning that now informs their approach. Here's the segment called Why I Passed. On today's special segment, we have Bryce Roberts of O'Reilly AlphaTech Ventures and Indy VC. Bryce, can you tell us a story about a startup that you passed on, why it was that you passed, and how that situation played out?
Wow. So I would say there's a lot of them. The most painful one would be we got my partner, Mark Jacobson and Tim O'Reilly had been a seed investor in a company called Blogger.com that was founded by Evan Williams. Blogger ended up getting bought by Google. It ended up being a great return for our fund. And so Evan had a podcasting thing that he had done called Odeo, and he had a new thing that he was working on called Twitter. And Mark had been kind of staying close to Evan, had been meeting with him about Twitter. He'd been kind of self-funding it. He'd given all the money back to investors on Odeo so he could self-fund Twitter. And we had just raised our new fund, and part of our fund was we laid out a very explicit set of rules for ourselves. We would write this size of check for this much ownership, and if we ever broke that rule, we would only do it if this caliber of fund were leading the investment. And so we had been talking to Evan. USV Fred had gotten him to agree to a term sheet, and nothing in that term sheet mapped to what we had told LPs. And so despite the fact that we had a relationship with Evan, despite the fact that we had an allocation in that seed round for Twitter, it broke so many of our rules, and we were so scared to go back to our LPs and have one of our very first deals be such a departure from what it was that we promised we would deliver as GPs that we ended up passing. And that was painful. I mean, it was absolutely a painful lesson to learn, but I'm glad we learned it early on, because I think that allowed us the confidence to be able to start breaking our rules more appropriately, not to go like hog wild and break our rules all the time. But man, that was a very, very painful lesson to learn.
I can imagine. Wow. On today's special segment, we have Maya Heyman of Converge Venture Partners. Maya, can you tell us about a startup that you were very interested in but ultimately passed on, and why it was that you passed?
Yes, but can I do it without naming names?
Yes, nobody names names, except when it's like an Uber or an Airbnb,
right,
and then they tell the story.
Wringing their hands. It's in a very hot sector. We're keen on the company, keen on the sector, and we ended up passing. As we dug in, we didn't think that the founding team, number one, understood how hard it was going to be to sell the product. So in other words, as hard as it is to build the technology, it's even harder to sell it. And we think this team didn't have the insight on how hard it was going to be to sell.
On today's special segment, we have Lyndall Ekman of Foundry Group Next. Lyndall, can you tell us a story about a fund that you passed on and why it was that you passed?
Boy, where do you start, right?
Without naming names, right?
Some of these aren't from venture, so I want to say that so that nobody thinks I'm talking about them in particular. But literally, the amount of chest beating, the boastfulness, the aggrandizing, it's quite amazing. Character issues are probably the most salacious. When I think of stories, you find cheating spouses, you find surprising background checks. Those are always fun. I give everybody a chance to raise their hand before I run one and say, hey, anything you need to tell me about, because surprises aren't a good thing, GPs. So go ahead and say it. My favorite might have been the mining fund executive that shoved the Greenpeace person out of the way when they were protesting. Never told his partners about it, and yet it came up on a background check, which you can imagine led to some interesting conversations internally in that partnership.
I bet.
That was a good one. I mean, the first meeting where a guy discussed smoking hash on the side of the river in Iceland, probably not something you want to cover in a first meeting.
Wow. Wow.
There's lots of false attribution. There's cherry picking of track records. We heard of one yesterday that somebody listed a reference, formally a reference on their reference sheet. And the person was like, why am I a reference for them? I haven't talked to them in 10 years. And by the way, I don't like them. There are a lot of colorful people and stories that you come across. There are a few more that you can certainly tell. One thing I will tell you that never works, or almost never works, is going over the staff person's head to a CIO or a board member. Pet peeve there. And a lot of funds just automatically disqualify themselves if they come in that direction.
I missed that last point. What do you mean by that?
So, rather than go in to the staff person at an endowment or at a pension, they'll say, oh, I know so-and-so on the board. I'm going to go to them.
Oh, I see.
And that's seen as political meddling, and that causes a lot of problems. Whereas if you were to go directly to the staff person and they were to engage, and then you went to to the board member and had them put in a good word, but didn't influence the decision at the outset, you might be a lot better off. So heads up to sort of protocol on that.
That will conclude this installment of Investor Stories. If you're enjoying the program and would like to see it continue, take a moment and leave a 5-star review in iTunes. Also, if you'd like updates on new content from TFR, as well as the top 10 VC articles every week, go to fullratchet.net and sign up for the newsletter. Okay, that will wrap things up for today. Until next time, over-prepare, choose carefully, and invest confidently. Thanks for joining me.